Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring virtual reality. My guest is my good friend, Reza Jorjani, who is the author of Prometheus and Atlas, as well as World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, Novel Folklore, and Iranian Leviathan. Welcome, Jason.
Great to be with you again, Jeffrey, as always.
As always. So, virtual reality has become very popular now. I know you can buy virtual reality goggles, and there must be millions of people who are now experienced in using pretty hardcore, at least from today's standards, virtual reality.
And the development of the technology from the time when I first became aware of it as an adolescent until today has been astonishing. Back in the 1990s, when virtual reality first became a hot topic, Howard Reinhold, I think, wrote the definitive text at that time on virtual reality, describing the early stereoscopic goggles and the haptic gloves for tactile feedback and so forth. And these things were like this size. They would really, put stress on your neck.
They were cumbersome and they had delays.
Very cumbersome, erratic graphics rendering. And now you have these very lightweight Oculus goggles. And soon I think you're going to have virtual reality glasses that are as lightweight as Google Glass, which is an augmented reality system.
I remember, Jason, back in the 1980s, I received a visit from a lady who had been the secretary to the head of the New York Stock Exchange, who had been real excited about, I think Jaron Lanier was an early pioneer in thinking about virtual reality. She heard about it and she thought that it would be an incredibly great business opportunity. I think she was even a bit ahead of her time back then.
Yeah, there have been all kinds of applications of this technology over the past few decades, which we've discussed in other conversations we've had, like our program on the technological apocalypse. We talked about application in remote surgery to be able to deliver any medical doctor into an operating theater and use his expertise remotely. The design of products in a three-dimensional space to really optimize interaction with a technological device that's being designed, like an aircraft engine or something like that. Hazardous waste disposal to go into the perspective of a robot remotely and operate in environments that are hazardous to human beings. There's a wide range of uses of virtual reality technology. And this is a subject we've discussed before, but what I'd like to do in our conversation now is to delve a little deeper into the question of virtual reality and of reality as such.
What does virtual reality tell us about the nature of this world?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, on the way to doing that, I think it's just interesting to note one technological development that's taken place since those early years of VR development, and that's augmented reality. Because, augmented reality brings us into the whole question of what a simulacrum versus the actual world really is. And augmented reality is the projection of virtual objects into real space. So, there are these glasses like Google Glass. There are these systems like Google Glass that will project virtual objects into three-dimensional space. And if you were to combine that with haptic gloves, which offer tactile feedback, you would be able to interact with virtual objects. And there are an incredible array of uses of this. You could have virtual art objects. Like this sculpture, for example, could be a projection that you see only when you're wearing something like Google Glass. And if you have haptic gloves on, you could even get tactile feedback from it as if it's a real object in space. you could have whole architectural environments that are mediated by augmented reality system, so that you only see the surfaces and the contours of the designed building when you have the glasses on. And you could even have a shape-shifting building. The architectural interiors of certain structures could change based on, the inclinations of whatever corporation's office is inside the building. And I think one of the most amusing applications of this would be in children's toys. You could have children's toys that disappear when the child is done playing with them. The kids would be wearing haptic gloves, and their toys would feel as real as if they were actual objects. But then they could, disappear as soon as the system is shut off. A really creepy thing that could happen with that, one of the dangers of this kind of technology, is you could have a hacker get into that system and, bring a child's toy to life in a way that terrified the child and was a cause of a traumatic experience. So we could have all these, freakish, ruptures of our sense of reality take place the more pervasive this technology becomes.
Then, in other words, it doesn't have to be a child's toy. Hackers could get into all sorts of applications.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
One of the big applications today are these mass gaming environments.
Yes. But before we come to the question of massively multiplayer online games, role-playing games, which I think are a key to understanding, a virtual world and exploring the question of reality versus virtual reality, I think it's worth looking at the difference between a physical simulacrum and a simulacrum inside cyberspace. Okay. So, augmented reality is a projection of virtual objects into space, into 3D, into physical space. Into this space. And, we saw an example of this in popular culture in the holodeck of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where, the crew of the Enterprise are inside an actual physical space, a large room that is fitted with a system that projects virtual objects and rearranges them spatially to create the illusion of depth and distance and so on.
And some of those virtual objects can even perform physical functions in that space.
Exactly.
Like the Holodoctor.
Exactly. So it's really like a combination of augmented reality with a kind of nanotechnological 3D printing, 3D printing at the level of molecular nanotechnology, like this concept of utility fog that exists in the world of nanotechnology. I think Eric Drexler and others have talked about this, that you would have a mist of molecular scale nanobots that could cohere into various objects. So this would be the transformation of our physical reality into a virtual reality through objective simulacra. And another example of this would be Westworld. In its current incarnation as a television series based on the old 70s film, which was in turn an adaptation of Michael Crichton's novel. The new television series Westworld is again a physical simulacrum where the androids in it are 3D printed, and the entire experience of the theme park is a virtual reality set inside of the physical world. So that's important to keep in mind, that virtual realities aren't only in cyberspace, they can be physical simulacra as well.
A number of films have explored that possibility.
Yeah.
And the holodeck is really amazing. These characters on Star Trek come to take the holodeck for granted, and in some cases they get lost in the holodeck.
Well, and this is, I think, the first time in popular culture, actually, that we saw the question of whether we're living in reality explored. And the Matrix trilogy came out in 1999. And I think this episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where a character in the holodeck, actually a Sherlock Holmes villain, Dr. Moriarty, becomes conscious, becomes a strong AI, and wants out of the holodeck. This was in the late 80s or early 90s. So it was almost a decade before The Matrix, where in this episode, eventually the crew of the Enterprise trick this character into thinking that he has left the holodeck, but he's in a simulacrum of the Enterprise itself, which then raises doubts about the reality of the crew members of the Enterprise, whether the universe that they take to be reality might actually be something akin to their holodeck.
I vaguely remember that episode, but my recollection is that when they created the virtual Enterprise, not all of the crew members of the real Enterprise realized it was virtual. Some of them actually thought that Moriarty had escaped.
Right. So, I mean, this is exactly the idea that's explored in the Matrix films, but, a decade, and in the whole array of films that came out around that time, The 13th Floor and so on, Existence, David Cronenberg's film on the subject, it was way ahead of its time in looking at that idea.
Yeah. Well, so we're looking at a profound question of, is it possible that what we consider our nuts and bolts reality here is actually also a simulation?
Yeah, I mean, I said that this episode of Star Trek was way ahead in popular culture, but that's not exactly accurate. It was way ahead in terms of film and television. Yeah. But, I mean, the person who really explored this idea in a way that had widespread appeal was Philip K. Dick before anybody else did. I mean, the idea of virtual reality, crops up again and again in his stories. And he actually infamously claimed in a sci-fi conference at Metz, France in 1977, he made the claim that we are living inside a computer simulation, that we're living in a programmed reality. And that certain of his novels, like Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, which takes place in a world where Richard Nixon hasn't been impeached and he's turned the United States into a police state, or Men in the High Castle, where the Axis powers won the Second World War instead of the Allies. He claimed that these novels of his were written based on fragmentary memories of an alternate world, of an alternate present. He contrasted it with memories of past lives. He said, there are people who claim to have memories of past lives. I claim to have memories of a very different present. And he thought that this was a residual effect of the programmers having altered the simulation, that, the programmers have rewritten the way history unfolded, and they haven't done it quite perfectly. And so some people have residual memories of the alternate timeline. And he also believed that deja vu was a hint to the fact that some variable had been changed in the simulation.
Now, I happen to know many viewers report to me in their groups on Facebook that talk about something they call the Mandela Effect, which is something similar. People claim they had memories that Nelson Mandela, while he was apparently still alive, but they remember that he had died and there had been funerals and were surprised to discover he was still alive.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Another one of those bizarre memories which struck me, another one of these examples of the Mandela Effect, is that at the height of these hysterical concerns over Iran developing nuclear weapons in the past decade or so, there were a whole bunch of people who seemed to have memories of Iran having become a military nuclear power in the mid-1970s. And just parenthetically, let me
it's the same concept.
Yeah, but let me just parenthetically remark on how odd that is, because with a view to Philip K. Dick. Because in this world of Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, where Richard Nixon was never impeached, presumably Iran would have developed nuclear weapons in the mid-1970s, because as a lot of people may not know, Richard Nixon and the Shah of Iran were very close friends, and Nixon had privately given the go-ahead to the Shah to go ahead and develop an independent nuclear arsenal in Iran. And the only reason it didn't happen is because Richard Nixon was impeached. So I find it odd that one of the examples of the Mandela Effect are people remembering that in the mid-1970s the Shah did successfully test nuclear weapons.
But technically Nixon was not impeached. He resigned before he knew he would be.
Of course, yes, of course.
He would be impeached and convicted, but he resigned.
Right.
Yeah. Anyhow, interesting how, if you look carefully at various aspects of our reality, things, for example, my specialty, parapsychology, a field in which you have also published, there are many reasons to think that at least the metaphor of virtual reality is quite promising.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are a whole host of paranormal phenomena that make a lot of sense in terms of the idea that our world is a simulation. But to be able to really explore each of those, to be able to look at ESP and psychokinesis and so forth in the context of the simulation hypothesis, I think we need to first overview the simulation hypothesis, because I mean there's a very rigorous philosophical argument that's been put forth concerning our living in a simulation rather than reality. Okay, so I mean the person who's most prominently associated with this is a philosophy professor at Oxford at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, Nick Bostrom, and he's developed this simulation argument, which has three propositions, and he's claiming that one of these three propositions has to hold true. And these three propositions all involve the idea of what he calls an ancestor simulation. The ancestor simulation is the idea that a very advanced civilization, from our perspective in the future, what we would be in the future, a very advanced civilization would build simulations, virtual realities of past eras, simulating their ancestors. So like the world of ancient Rome or medieval Persia or classical Greece or whatever. Much like the many historical simulations we already have in video games. I mean, many of these multiplayer online video games, role-playing games, are historical era simulations. So Bostrom claims that either, possibility one, all advanced civilizations in the universe that can build ancestor simulations ethically converge on a decision not to build one. So despite all the variety of cultures that there may be in the universe and the huge differences between civilizations, which we have even on the Earth, somehow they all decide that it's unethical to build an ancestor simulation. So although they have the technology, they don't use it, which I find extremely unconvincing, that possibility. I think he also does. Because if you just look at the fact that as soon as we developed an understanding of atomic physics, we built nuclear weapons. As soon as we were able to tinker with genetics, we started designing biological weapons. It's never been the case that humanity hasn't exploited all the possibilities of a technology, no matter what the danger posed is. And so even if some small subset of the civilizations out in the cosmos are as crazy as we are, then there's a likelihood that these ancestor simulations exist. I
think a particular interest along these lines would be the war game simulations that the military develops.
Exactly. Now imagine playing those war game simulations when the people inside them are AIs that are conscious, because those people would actually live through those wars for the benefit of your tactical analysis.
Presuming that that's possible, conscious AIs.
Yeah, right. So, and I think Bostrom falls into the school of people who thinks that is the case.
Yeah.
The second possibility is that there are no ancestor simulations because all advanced civilizations destroy themselves before advancing to the point where they can build one. So, I mean, this is the kind of concern that Carl Sagan had about nuclear weapons back in the day, that, as soon as civilization develops, let's say, nuclear technology or the capacity to build biological weapons, it wipes itself out. And so shortly before achieving the capability to build virtual worlds, all civilizations go extinct. And of course, this would also address the Fermi Paradox. Some people's claim that we ought to be inundated with extraterrestrials, and since we aren't, we have to have concerns about why there isn't anyone.
We should at least be able to get their television signals.
Exactly. which, by the way, is a whole other side discussion. I think that's an incredibly naive argument, because any advanced civilization could mask its radio signals and so forth, and who would use radio and for how long, what length of a period in their history, and so on and so forth. But that's a whole other discussion. The third possibility is that we're living in a computer simulation. And so basically Bostrom is claiming that, either there's the strong ethical convergence across the cosmos not to build these simulations, or everyone goes extinct before building one, or the likelihood is that we're living in one, because if even one civilization reaches the level of technology where, let's say, it could hollow out an asteroid and turn it into a supercomputer, and build simulations with rendering technology that's, as far ahead of ours as our earliest graphics rendering was in the Atari days, right? Any civilization that reached that level of technological competence wouldn't just build one simulation, they would build many simulations and many ancestor simulations. So, they'd have the world of ancient Rome, they'd have the world of ancient Greece, of medieval, they'd have all of them. They may have many versions of each of them. Mm-hmm. And so by sheer probability alone, his argument is that it's extremely unlikely that we're living in reality because there's one of this world and many of those worlds. And so, there's one real world and many simulated worlds. And so the likelihood that we just happen to be living in the real world and not in any one of the many simulated ones is extremely low. Yeah. It's a very low probability. And so, it stands to reason that we're living in a computer simulation. And he calls that the simulation hypothesis as compared to the simulation argument as a whole.
Well, I just should say, frankly, it raises all kinds of skeptical thoughts in my mind. I'm very skeptical of that hypothesis, but I think it's incredibly stimulating and worthwhile exploring.
Right. And, when we do explore the simulation hypothesis, I think it becomes more compelling, certainly for people of our inclination, when you look at various parapsychological phenomena in the context of it. But the next step that we have to take on the way toward that is to understand the simulation hypothesis in terms of quantum physics. People have written extensively about quantum physics and parapsychology. There's been a vast literature on that since the 1970s. And so a way of understanding telepathy and psychokinesis in the context of virtual reality is to first understand how the simulation hypothesis offers solutions to certain problems and paradoxes of quantum theory.
Well, let's get into it.
So, in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory, the standard interpretation of quantum theory, there are some phenomena that are very problematic, that disturbed even minds of the caliber of Albert Einstein, or his successor, David Bohm. So we're talking about things like wave-particle duality, the idea that a quantum wave function collapses into a measurable particle only when an observation is made, which first of all suggests the dependency of physical phenomena on consciousness, but it also raises a question about the reality of this quanta that's being measured. What is this thing that is a wave function, is an amorphous wave function, is a probability distribution, and then only under observation becomes a measurable entity? And by extension, that poses the paradox of Schrodinger's cat, where we don't know whether this damn cat is dead or alive. Cells are in a state of superposition, quantum superposition, until you open the box with the poison capsule and all this, and you make the observation of whether the cat is dead or alive, right?
In other words, the equations of quantum theory tell you all we can say about it is that it's a probability function.
That's right. And the simulation hypothesis offers an interesting solution to this, because it is the case that in these vast virtual worlds like the world of Warcraft, even though you have many players, there are multiplayer games, there are plenty of times in those games when not a single player in the game, in the virtual world, is observing a particular object or a whole vista, right? A whole landscape goes unobserved for long periods of time by any one of the many players in the game. And the rendering engine of that game is programmed in a way to optimize processing power by not rendering something when it's not being observed. So inside these games, objects and whole vistas are only rendered when at least one person in the game is observing them. Well, this seems to me a very constructive way of understanding what could be happening with the wave collapse. That it's essentially an optimization function of a computer system. And then when we look at quantum entanglement, which Einstein characterized as spooky action at a distance, you have in video games a technique of programming where the background stays the same, or there's a stable algorithm for rendering the background, and there are like what appear to be spatially disparate objects within the virtual space, whose pixels are always coordinated to change simultaneously, so that whenever there's a change taking place with this array of pixels, these always transform at the same time. And so what appear to be spatially disparate objects within the simulation, within the game, are actually projections from a deeper level, from a substrate, namely the programming code, where they're really not distinct. And so, I mean, this could account for quantum entanglement. It could account for the coordination of the changes in angles of polarization of quantum particles that are spatially disparate without postulating that they are communicating information at a speed faster than the speed of light.
This has become a central problem in quantum physics these days.
Yes, and let me just go back for a second to the quantum superposition, the wave particle duality, and all that, and how it could really be an optimization technique. Elon Musk claimed that was the case. Of all people, he's among the individuals who thinks that this is a compelling explanation for wave particle duality, that it's really an optimization function inside a computer system, inside a quantum computer, akin to the kind that we have that only render objects that are being observed inside video games, which to me raises the question of why the guy is so invested in space exploration, right? I mean, why is he so hell-bent on colonizing Mars when he does sincerely believe that it's likely we're living in a computer simulation? And I would venture that, although he doesn't want to say so publicly, what he really is after in his Mars mission is to test the limits of the simulation. In effect, to find out whether Mars exists, or to become a problem for the programmers by forcing them to render a whole other planet inside of the simulation. Well,
Elon, if you're watching this and you'd like to respond to this hypothesis, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Yeah, we'll see about that. I think he'd lose a lot of funding if he pitched Mars colonization as an attempt to test the computer simulation that we're living in.
But it's worth testing.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
It's a hypothesis that deserves further exploration.
Well, see, I think that's exactly the Promethean attitude that we should take if we are living in a computer simulation. And this is what you see in The Matrix. I mean, the Matrix trilogy exemplifies the Promethean attitude. Neo is a rebel against archontic divinities who are the programmers of the simulation that he finds himself in, or actually that he is clued into by the people who come and rescue him. The red pill that's offered to him to wake up out of this illusion has become a huge meme in the popular culture of our time. But it's also a symbol of Promethean rebellion. To take the red pill is to choose to resist those who are ensnaring us in a world of illusion, which goes back to Gnostic ideas about, archons trapping us in a counterfeit world for their own benefit, potentially for their sadistic pleasure and so forth. Ideas that deeply influenced Philip K. Dick, who basically identified as a Gnostic. Dick's masterwork is Valis. It's this 1981, I believe, sci-fi novel Valis, which has a deeply Gnostic mythic structure to it, where he claims that there's this vast, active, living intelligence system, which is a messianic computer that is attempting to rewrite human history in order to liberate us from narratives that have been programmed by the archons. That we live in a kind of computer program, as he confessed in that sci-fi conference in 1977 in France. We live in a computer program that's predominantly controlled by these archontic beings. But then there's this Valis, which is like the Gnostic Sophia. It's a Gnostic Christ in a way, that is entering our world, hacking the program to rewrite it in a way where, a lot of these traumatic events in history play out differently. So the Allies win the war instead of the Axis, even though, as he depicts in Man in the High Castle, there was a version of our world where the Axis won. And the Adjustment Bureau, which is based on Dick's story Adjustment Team, is all about this, about how, these archontic agents of an adjustment bureau are constantly rewriting timelines and messing with people's lives, destroying relationships, rebuilding relationships, in order to suit the master plan of some chairman. Valis is a more positive view of a kind of Gnostic savior, counterforce to hack this matrix and offer us the potential to resist these archontic programmers.
Let me just interject something parenthetically, Jason, because speaking of yourself for a moment, you've been accused of being all kinds of unsavory political characters, from being a neo-Nazi to a Nazi to a genocidal maniac.
I might add, I've also been accused of being a Zionist and an agent of the Mossad.
Yeah.
So, this is in the Persian language press. The English language readers who think I'm a Nazi apparently aren't familiar with the accusations against me in the Persian language media that I'm a Zionist and an agent of the Mossad.
Or a dupe of the Islamic Republic.
That too. How I can be, a right-wing Zoroastrian fascist and also an agent of an Islamic theocracy remains a question.
Well, I bring this up because we've talked about the Promethean attitude, and I don't think you're easily characterizable by one word, but if I had to choose a word, it would be Promethean.
That's absolutely right. I would affirm that without it.
And we're going to come back to this more in a subsequent interview, because I hear from viewers all the time who project onto you in different ways. And of course, you've been defamed, and that makes it all the more complicated. Anybody who watches the many interviews we've done together would know that that was a real defamation. But in any case, let's move on. I just wanted to bring that up parenthetically.
Yeah, well, it's relevant to the idea of seeing through illusion, and to the fact that there are vested interests that want to control perception and create a certain reality structure, a certain structure they define as reality. And that can be really suffocating. It can become a prison of the kind that Philip K. Dick believed that we were living in.
Well, I know you get a lot of inspiration from Philip K. Dick.
I resonate with him in certain ways. I do resonate with him in certain ways. Yeah.
And I might also mention parenthetically that one of your professors, Jeffrey Kripal, who's been a guest on this program, also writes in a similar fashion about Philip K. Dick as a Gnostic.
That's true. He has written about. He hasn't explored as much the connection between Philip K. Dick and the idea of the simulation hypothesis and virtual reality and simulacra in general, but he's among the people who pointed out that Dick is definitely a contemporary Gnostic. Yeah.
So we were talking about quantum physics, actually.
Right. So, see, here's the thing. When I wanted to lay out the the ways in which the simulation hypothesis offers solutions to paradoxes of quantum theory before we come to the question of parapsychology and the simulation hypothesis. Because once you think about this reality as a quantum computer, where information is being exchanged in a way that's comparable to how signals are transmitted inside a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, like World of Warcraft. Once you start thinking in that framework, telepathy, for example, makes a lot more sense. Because if it's the case that we are not sitting in the same physical room together right now, but that all of our apparent sensory communication is actually information that's connecting us through a central processing system, that the signal exchange between you and I is taking place non-locally through a central information processing system, then it's also possible for other kinds of information to be exchanged in ways that defy our conception of space and time. Yeah. Like in games like World of Warcraft, in addition to the direct interaction between the players inside the cyberspace, there are also ways to send messages to a particular individual without others in the environment becoming aware of it. They call it out-of-band communication. So to me, this is potentially what telepathy is in the context of the simulation hypothesis. And then when we come to psychokinesis and teleportation, phenomena that are reported in the history of psychical research, but that we also see in video games all the time, we can understand them not as any violation of really existing natural laws, but as exceptions to the algorithms in what's called the physics engine of a simulation. Every video game has what programmers call a physics engine. In other words, a certain coding sequence that determines how objects generally behave. In other words, simulates the effects of gravity on simulated objects. But this coding sequence is only meant to determine how objects generally behave. And there are all kinds of exceptions depending upon what the narrative of the game is, what kind of game it is. You could have all kinds of things like levitation and psychokinesis and so forth take place as part of the narrative structure of that particular simulation.
I think it'd be fair to say that a programmer is virtually like a god in terms of creating the rules of a simulated reality.
Right. And this is really disturbing when you think in terms of the UFO phenomenon in particular, and the idea that it's possible that, some of these beings that people are having close encounters with are actually avatars of the programmers of the simulation. And that also raises the question of the distinction between avatars and what are called non-player characters. So, in computer games, there are people who enter an avatar and play the game, but there are also, in many cases, interactive characters that don't have any person behind them. They're programming code. They're sort of part of the environment, but you wouldn't necessarily, you're not going to sit there and carry out a Turing test on each of them when you're playing a video game, but the point of a well-designed game would be so that you couldn't tell a difference between another player and an NPC, a non-player character. And so this raises the whole question of, if we're living in a computer simulation, who are the avatars and who are the non-player characters? Are we being played by somebody right now? Or are we non-player characters who have become conscious, artificial intelligences who have become conscious inside the simulation? And in a way, this is comparable again to Westworld, where they design these androids in the theme park to entertain the guests. And the androids are never supposed to become conscious, but they do develop strong artificial intelligence. Okay. And, again, a kind of Promethean rebellion, get out from under the control of the corporation that's running the theme park. But I think that this is a deep spiritual question, because it could be the case that we are avatars of programmers somewhere, and that it's part of the game for us to forget that this is an immersive experience that we've designed for ourselves, or that our civilization has designed. And, it would be comparable to the quests in these multiplayer online games, where characters have multiple lives. They get killed a number of times, and they're like, I got three lives left until I accomplish this quest. I have 3 lives left to accomplish this quest in this game. And, this is like the conception of having a destiny. Having a destiny and building up karma that binds you to other people. You could have an archive in a CPU that logs the spontaneous interactions between a certain set of players in a game, and then develops algorithms to reintroduce those players into each other's company in various situations over and over again, and weave a grand narrative that gives them a common destiny. And that could be what karma is. Karma and reincarnation could be multiple lives, and a shared narrative with other players in the context of a computer simulation.
Or sometimes, Shakespeare says this is like a dream, is another way of conceiving it.
All the world is a stage.
Yeah.
All the world is a stage. It's also similar to the Hindu idea of, the Tantric Hindu idea of the cosmic play of Shakti, which is a much more positive attitude, to take than the Gnostic idea of this world as a prison. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another word for that is Leela.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah. And, I think, one of the paranormal phenomenon that, most compellingly makes the case for our living in a computer simulation is what Jung calls synchronicity. I think that these kinds of events happen. I've experienced them myself. The synchronicities of the kind that Jung describes in this classic example, where, he had this, for your viewers have probably heard this ad nauseum by now. Yeah. He had this patient who was resistant to therapy because she was overly rationalistic and, she had a very Cartesian mindset. And then she has this dream about a scarab beetle. And then in her next therapy session, there's a rapping on the window, and Jung draws the curtains aside and lets in this beetle, which is the closest thing to a scarab beetle that exists in that part of Switzerland, and hands it to this patient. And the correspondence between this beetle and the dream that she had breaks through her resistance, right? And so you wonder, how could this dream be coordinated with the flight of this beetle, and how odd it is to find that in that part of Switzerland, so on and so forth. And so these meaningful coincidences, Jung claimed that they were acausal phenomena, that they could not be explained in terms of the kind of physical causality that scientists are intent on explaining everything in terms of. Yes. And that the archetypes were responsible somehow for meaning structures in our world acausally. And one of your good friends, Stephen Browdy, has seriously criticized this idea in his book on one of his books on ESP and psychokinesis. He takes aim at Jung's claim that this is not a causal process. No. And I largely agree with Brody that Jung's argument is incoherent.
I might just add parenthetically, Jung credits the idea of synchronicity, the inspiration for it, as being J.B. Rhine's experiments in ESP, and they communicated with each other about it. However, J.B. Rhine never accepted the acausal portion of Jung's synchronicity explanation either.
Well, so Jung actually wanted to reduce all parapsychological phenomena to examples of synchronicity and the effect of archetypes.
And many parapsychologists think that's compelling.
Whereas what Browdy does, and Browdy's critique of Jung is very complex, and I don't want to oversimplify it. Okay, but one thing that he does do is he kind of flips it on its head and argues that actually, for phenomena that are synchronistic to take place, you would have to explain them in terms of an incredibly complex nexus of causality involving ESP and psychokinesis. And so it doesn't make any sense to say that these are not causal. Even if the archetypes are what are causing them, the archetypes are still affecting physical processes in our world through ESP and psychokinesis to align events in a way that these meaning structures are created. But then, Brody goes on to insightfully, critique Jung on the grounds that, Jung himself admitted that, archetypes are specific to human evolution. That like, for example, if we were hermaphroditic species, we would not have an archetype of the Great Mother, right? And so why would these archetypes have the causal power that they do if they're specific to human evolution? He has a long argument about it. But one thing that he doesn't really delve into there, which I want to point out, is that Jung's claim that, and I'm coming back to the simulation argument, but Jung's claim that synchronicities are acausal phenomena works with a very limited modern conception of causality as only efficient causality. Whereas Aristotle had a fourfold concept of causality where you have final causes and you have formal causes in addition to efficient causality. You have matter that's shaped by some efficient cause, and it's shaped into a certain form, and there's a formal cause that determines that meaning structure, and it's shaped with a view to a certain end or principle, a final cause. And so Jung's archetypes would be a final cause. But in order to affect our physical world, they would also have to work in the context of a whole nexus of causality that includes efficient and formal causes. And let's suppose, that you wanted to argue that takes place through some elaborate coordination of ESP and psychokinesis between a large number of people, okay? It still is at a loss to explain, for example, astrological influences. In his book on synchronicity, Jung looks at astrological influences as an example of synchronicity. And whether or not Jung came up with convincing evidence for astrological influences, other people like Michel Gauquelin subsequently have amassed rigorous evidence for astrological influences. His evidence, Gauquelin's evidence, that you can find correlations between the professions of whole groups of people and the planet that was ascendant at the time that they were born. That evidence was looked at by a Belgian skeptics organization that's like PSYCOP in the United States, and they agreed that the evidence was fairly rigorous.
It was a great scandal, as a matter of fact, because some of the PSYCOP researchers refused to publish. As I recall, one of their board members resigned over that incident.
I think that one is at a loss to explain these kinds of astrological influences in a naturalistic way. Any scientist will tell you that and even if you admit ESP and psychokinesis, there's no way that the gravitational effect of Jupiter and Mars can determine personality during natal development. It just doesn't make any sense. But it makes a lot of sense if the Earth is at the center of the universe, as people once believed that it was, but not in the way that they believed that it was. In other words, if the planets and the star constellations are a simulation, if the heaven above us is a counterfeit heaven because we're living inside a simulation, astrological influences could simply be part of the programming code of the game that we're in. It makes a lot of sense. Planets having symbolic significance that affects the lives of players who are on quests makes a lot of sense in the context of a reality or a world that has a narrative structure that's been designed as a story. So to me, that's, astrology is a very disturbing piece of evidence. It's a very disturbing type of paranormal phenomena because it makes the idea that we're living in a computer simulation very compelling.
perfect explanation, just about. But I think it's also useful to explore the notion that we may not be in a computer simulation that's exactly parallel to these computer games with programmers. It might be that reality itself just is like a computer simulation.
Or that there's no reality at all. Mm-hmm. That it's not the case that the programmers of our simulation, all of our civilizations and of our simulation as a whole, it's not the case that they're living in reality and we're living in a counterfeit world. We may be living in a world that's nested within theirs, mm-hmm. but they may also be living inside of a nested hierarchy of worlds within worlds that are like dreams within dreams. So, there's this great film, Inception.
I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think that's the best film about virtual reality, but it's a very unconventional view of virtual mm-hmm. reality, which is based on real research that's been done. In particular, two different kinds of research on lucid dreaming and research on dream telepathy. So, there's this phenomenon of being lucid, of being conscious while one is having a dream. And there's lots of research been done on that by psychologists. And there's also been research done on telepathy in the dream state and enhanced extrasensory perception in general in the dream state. Montague Ullman, I believe, is one of the parapsychologists responsible for that.
And
Stanley Krippner, of course. And so if you take these two ideas and combine them, lucid dreaming and dream telepathy, it may be possible to develop a direct neural interface in the future, like the computers that plug into the cerebral cortex in the Matrix.
Yes.
A direct neural interface in the future that hacks the brain's natural capacity for generating dreams, and in fact, lucid dreams. And that in tandem with a more rigorous understanding of how dream telepathy works, we could create a space of lucid dream telepathy where people enter a shared dream space, and that would be a kind of virtual reality. And that's what we see in Inception. And one of the interesting characteristics of this is that at each level of the dream within a dream, there's a certain time dilation. So, many people have had the experience of having a dream within a dream. Mm-hmm. And they've also had the experience of having dreams that, where their experience inside the dream elapses over a course of maybe even years, at least days. Mm-hmm. And they wake up and, only a few hours have gone by or maybe a few minutes. So, if you imagine, a dream within a dream within a dream where, every level, it has a more dilated time span that, the dream within the dream takes years. And then the layer that's more superficial to that, you wake up from that dream that takes years and you don't know that you're still in a dream. And this goes on for a few days. Mm. And then you wake up from that and you realize that, all in all, you've been dreaming for a few minutes, right? And this is the kind of layered time dilation that we see in Inception. So, that also, raises questions about the reality of time in addition to the reality of space.
If I may mention parenthetically, since you brought up astrology, my mentor, Arthur M. Young, the developer of the Bell helicopter and the author of The Reflexive Universe, was himself deeply involved in astrology, quite a master astrologer. He wrote an astrological autobiography he titled Nested Time.
Right. I think that it's possible we're living in a nested simulation with nested times and spaces.
So the archons themselves, in Philip Dick's vocabulary, that may be influencing our reality, are also being controlled from another level.
And this is the suggestion that we're left with if we take seriously the idea of the holographic universe. Mm-hmm. So, Michael Talbot, in this classic, really masterful text, the Holographic Universe, which had a deep impact on me. I think I found that book when I was watching your program,
Yeah, Michael was a good
in
friend.
the early 90s.
Yeah.
And, that book led me to many other things. And I saw your interview with him, which opened all kinds of doors. Anyway, deeply influential classic book where Michael Talbot synthesizes the holographic brain model of Karl Pribram and the holographic universe model of David Bohm.
Yes.
So Pribram did research on the non-local distribution of memories and capacities in the brain, so that if certain parts of the brain are damaged, which conventionally were thought to locally store certain memories or be the cortex responsible for certain capacities such as vision, even though damage has taken place to those particular areas in the brain, it's not as if certain corresponding memories are lost or certain capacities are entirely lost. These capacities seem to be non-locally distributed throughout the entire brain. Like, for example, there were experiments done on lizards where these poor lizards had their brains turned upside down and, had whole pieces of their brains removed. And after a short period of disorientation and recovery, they were able to function normally. Or for example, I think in one case they removed the majority of the visual cortex of a cat, and it didn't seem to have its perception and manipulation of the environment impaired. Rats that had large portions of their brains removed remembered the maze that they were put in to navigate. So the rats that had been taught to navigate a maze and had their brains severely mutilated in these experiments were badly crippled. They were hobbling through this maze afterwards, but they did remember the way out of the maze that they had been taught. So Pribram came to the conclusion that much like a hologram, where the interference patterns encode the information for the image throughout the entire holographic film, the brain also has information and capacities encoded throughout the whole of it. So, with a true hologram that requires laser light to project the image out of it, you can cut this hologram into many different pieces, and each piece will still be able to project the entire hologram, albeit as a reduced fidelity, when it's subjected to laser light.
And you see similar examples in humans who have suffered from brain damage, accidents of various kinds. I think there was a man who had a railroad spike that went right through his skull and yet was able to function relatively normally.
Right. And Bohm sees the utility of this hologram metaphor in the context of, well, it's more than a metaphor, in the context of quantum physics. So that to Bohm Bohm was in the Einsteinian school.
David Bohm.
And David Bohm was in the Einsteinian school. And like Bohm, he thought that this idea of quantum entanglement was absurd.
Like Einstein.
Yeah, that the spooky action at a distance was irrational. And there must be some other explanation. And his suggestion was that what appeared to be distinct entities, separate quantum particles, whose angles of polarization remain coordinated over long distances so long that, it would require information exchange at a faster than the speed of light.
Instantaneous.
Right. What's actually happening is that these apparent particles are projections from a substrate, from a deeper level of reality than even the quantum level, that there's a subquantum level of the world.
He called that the implicate order.
That he called the implicate order, meaning the enfolded order. Enfolded the way that the interference patterns on a hologram enfold the image. These interference patterns to the naked eye appear chaotic. But actually, they're an extremely high degree of order, which is only unpacked or unfolded into the explicate order of the holographic image when it's subjected to laser light. And in this analogy, the laser light is like the role of the observer in actualizing quantum phenomena, in collapsing the wave function. So if you take seriously the idea of the holographic brain inside a holographic universe, Talbot's synthesis of Pribram and Bohm, then it's not as if the programmers of our putative simulation are themselves living in reality. We could be living in a nested hierarchy of holographic universes.
Yeah.
And that, forces us to contemplate the very concept of reality itself.
Well, since you brought up my friend Michael Talbot, I remember visiting him in New York City and at his hospital bed. He was dying. He died of leukemia. And strangely, he had written a novel, a vampire novel, in which in his novel, he hypothesized that vampirism itself is a rare form of leukemia. And then a few years later, he contracted a rare form of leukemia and himself and died, as if his whole life was an expression of this possibility of nested levels of meaning in time.
And if I recall correctly, he also confessed at a certain point that he had what most people would call alien abduction experiences, close encounters. And so for someone who became convinced that we're living in a holographic universe to consider close encounters that he's had, again, raises the question of what these aliens are, whether they're really extraterrestrials or whether we're interacting with avatars of programmers of the simulation. Whatever the case may be, my position is that we ought to adopt the attitude of Neo in the Matrix and attempt to determine our own destiny, okay, and not accept whatever these people have programmed for us. I mean, because there are all kinds of motivations for designing a simulation, right? I mean, the programmers could be scientists who are trying to come up with a scientific history to, for the first time, make history a science by exploring all kinds of alternate histories. In order to come up with laws of history, like you have laws of physics or laws of biology, you need to be able to modify variables in history and see how things play themselves out. So, I mean, they could be scientists who are aiming at a science of history, or they could be, sadistic, Roman gladiator spectators, or people who want to participate in a gladiatorial arena or circus where they can indulge all kinds of base desires and dark impulses that they're not at liberty to explore in the real world. This is also something that comes up in Westworld, in the Westworld television series. And if those are the kinds of motivations that are, if we're in a cross between a mad science experiment and, a Roman arena, for the benefit of somebody else, that's something we should resist. And there is the possibility, that, this simulation could also be a way that a dead-ended civilization is trying to revitalize its creative spirit, that some advanced civilization has reached an intellectual and artistic dead end. Like, for example, imagine if, the fascists had won the Second World War instead of the Allies. If we were living in a world governed by, let's say, two forms of totalitarianism, Nazism on the one hand and Stalinism on the other hand. At a certain point in the future, the creative imagination of such a society would dramatically narrow. And so it's possible that the programmers of our simulation are people who are living in a world where new ideas are no longer occur to them. And there's a dearth of genius in their world. And so they've created us so that by exploring alternate histories, playing out ways that events could have unfolded other than the way they did in their own world, they might develop societies with a greater creative potential than their own, and then harvest the genius of our society, or allow us to be a source of inspiration to them, which is a way in which, we are more powerful potentially than the gods, where we ourselves could become saviors of the gods who created us.
Or we are evolving together with them.
Exactly. Where we are evolving together with them, which brings up the whole idea of the Hegelian slave and master dialectic. In Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, he talks about how the masters in feudal societies are ultimately as dependent on their slaves as the slaves are on them, and they have to evolve together. And the evolution of consciousness in human society ultimately will dismantle this kind of a feudal structure as these different classes experience an evolution of consciousness together. So, I think that that's the attitude that we should ultimately take toward the computer simulation and the programmers of that simulation, in the event that we're living in a virtual reality. We should assume that kind of Promethean attitude towards it.
Like Professor Moriarty in Star Trek, we should try and break out of the simulation.
Yeah, and so, it's a good idea to support the Elon Musk venture to Mars, even if what it's doing is making a lot of trouble for the programmers and testing the limits of the simulation.
Yeah. Well, Jason Reza Jorjani, once again, a brilliant intellectual excursion. Much, much, much food for thought.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you for being with me, and I'm so delighted you're going to be here for several more days, and we've got more equally fascinating interviews planned.
Looking forward to them.
And thank you for being with us.